All right, we made it to the end. This is the third learning objective video for topic 6.1. Here we're going to talk very briefly about environmental regulation. And by very briefly, I just mean that it's not covered in length in the book, which I think is actually a failing of this book, which I'm going to fix in future semesters. So I'm just going to touch briefly on it. There's a video that you can watch which is interesting and kind of summarizes some of the environmental regulation. And what I mean to say is it's not that it's not important. In fact, it's hugely important. Maybe the most important type of regulation, depending on your perspective. Businesses, of course, don't like it because it creates expense, but this is how we're going to solve the climate change problem. And if we need to get the environmental regulation right to do that, so which is kind of a problem in the present time. Okay, so let's take just a quick look here. This is the video. Again, I'm not going to show it to you here, of course. You can watch it on your own, and I recommend that you do so. So here is a list of the kinds of activities that are regulated. And this is not labor unions. This is not, so ignore that. This is environmental. Okay, so what do we mean here? So for the most part, if you think about it, the environment, and this is kind of interesting with what's happening in the current day with states like California and others who disagree with the national policy. As you might imagine, the environment, a lot like is the case with national defense, it kind of has to be nationalized. I mean, it's difficult, for example, to fix the clean air problem in one state because state air doesn't just stay within the political boundaries. So it generally has been handled as a national policy, although the states have their own law as well. And lately what's been happening is states, particularly states like California, have disagreed with the Trump administration's environmental policy, have gone their own way on things like climate change and reducing carbon emissions and so forth. There's been a tug of war or power between the federal and the state governments over who has authority to deal with this. But environmental regulation regulates every element of the environment. So, for example, water, navigable waterways are subject to regulation. There was a famous case not all that long ago of a person who there was a rain puddle on his property that wasn't very big, but it didn't drain, so it stayed there. It became kind of a small pond, only a few feet in size, and migratory birds were using it for nesting or for resting on the migration or whatever it was. And the federal government used the federal water regulations to regulate that water. They determined that was navigable water but even though it was on private land. And so this is where you find some friction when property owners can't develop their property or whatever because of water regulations. Same thing is true with air. Air pollution has been regulated, and it's hard to imagine how bad it was when I was a kid in the 1970s in Southern California. We used to have, when I was in grade school, we had smog alerts. So we actually had days where we had to have lunch inside, like if it was raining, except it was because literally the air smelt like it was on fire. The sky would be bright red, and it literally smelt like it was on fire. And this was from all of the lead in gas. Right now, when you buy gas at the gas station, it's all unleaded. But it didn't used to be that way. It used to have lead in it, and all that lead pumped into the air and created this environmental catastrophe. And they finally clamped down on that, and it's amazing to think about it now. And the air quality in Southern California is still terrible, but it's way better than it was in the 1970s. The land is the same way. The environmental regulations can affect your land rights. So when we talked in the last module about property rights. One of the limitations on property rights is restrictions on land. In California, there's a very powerful agency there called the Coastal Commission, and if your property is within a certain distance of the coast, if you own coastal property, basically you can't do anything with it without getting the approval of the Coastal Commission. Same thing is true here in Washington. There's a reason why it's actually almost impossible to build a marina or a dock anymore, where you have to pile drive the pilings into the ground to support a dock, because to do that would agitate all the sediment at the bottom, and there's a lot of bad stuff in that sediment. Here in Tacoma, there used to be a smelter, a metal smelter, and all of the pollution from that went up into the air, came down into the water, and settled down into the silt. And if you agitate that silt, there's mercury and all kinds of bad stuff that gets thrown up into the water. So if you own a dock that has pilings, you can replace the dock, the upper part of it. You need to get permission from the government to do that, but replacing those pilings is almost impossible, or so prohibitively expensive that nobody ever does it. So the point of it is that environmental regulation acts as a restriction on land rights. And then nuclear power is regulated by the Nuclear Power Regulatory Authority. So you can't just open a nuclear power plant if that's what you want to do. You have to get a license from the federal government to do that, and that activity is regulated. And one of the big problems with nuclear power is we don't have a place to put the waste. We've been trying to find a place to put it. They were going to bury it in a mountain in the desert, but the local people, local governments there successfully fought against that. So we don't have a place to put all the waste, so it's being stored in and around the facilities that have stopped, where it's not being used anymore. So it's really a terrible catastrophe that they're still trying to solve. Wildlife regulation deals with like endangered species, that sort of thing. And I already mentioned the coastal environment and how that's regulated too. And again, it's generally federal, but most states have a significant amount of their own environmental regulation, and sometimes the state and the federal governments fight over who has the power to deal with it. Okay, that's all I have on environmental regulation. I hope that was helpful. Thank you for watching the videos, and I look forward to seeing you in class. Thanks a lot.